Welcome to the October 12th, 2013 edition of Outside the Box Radio. I'm Alex Ansary, and we're streaming live over at AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Thank you all for tuning in tonight, and for those listening later, over at AlexAnsary.tv under the recent interview section on the front page. In the first hour, we have Joel Skousen, who is a publisher of World Affairs Brief. It's a weekly internet news analysis service. He's also the author of The Secure Home and Strategic Relocation, which is what we're focusing on tonight. And Joel's one of the most respected geopolitical analysts who's been a regular guest on talk shows over the years, and he and I spoke in 2009 in Portland about his forecast for a coming world war with China at some point, possibly, in our future. So I posted that interview on the front page of AlexAnsary.tv right now, so it's an honor to talk with him again and get an update on current events, what's taking place in Syria, the so-called government shutdown, and, of course, his book, Strategic Relocation. Joel, thanks for taking the time to be here tonight.
It's my pleasure, Alex. It's good to be with you. It's been a few years.
Yes, it has. How are you? What have you been up to lately?
Well, of course, the world events are very, very hot and heavy in terms of trying to keep up with that and do my weekly analysis on the World Affairs Brief. But it also has meant that as things have gotten worse, especially with the economy and the threat of many things looming, that my consulting business about strategic relocation and secure homes has also increased dramatically. And so I'm consulting 3 or 4 times a day, as well as researching for my World Affairs Brief.
Well, I figured in the first section, this first segment tonight, we would get an update from you on current events, geopolitics, and then in the second segment and third segment, we can get more into your book. So what is the truth about this government shutdown that we need to be aware of? And where is their disinformation?
Well, part of the disinformation is involved with the fact that this is a shutdown. Actually, about 80% of the government is still operating. And the 20% that isn't operating, especially the furloughed employees on many of these extraneous 3-letter agencies, are doing damage to our through excess regulation. So the nation is really better off with a lot of those people on furlough. Unfortunately, the administration has tried to do their best to inconvenience people and literally, drive certain people out of business that depend on the federal government, even for permission to operate. Certain people need permission from the EPA. Others need permission from the Bureau of Reclamation or the Army Corps of Engineers. And those permissions, even though that requires very little staff, are being denied just to make life difficult for us. And in last week's World Affairs Brief, I covered a litany of problems of the United States, basically shutting down things of which there is no manned presence. Now, that's proof that you're not out to save the government money. You're not out, to essentially because you don't have the money to pay for something. I mean, there are federal lands that have been closed off so that people who even live there, have leases on federal land, cannot access their property. You have people who have boats in marinas on places that are under the BLM jurisdiction, and they've been closed off. There's absolutely no reason for those types of things. So this is a war of inconvenience, trying desperately the administration to pass the blame on the Republicans. But most people who are severely inconvenienced by this partial shutdown are in fact blaming the White House because they know it's not necessary. Unfortunately, the media is putting almost 100% of the blame on the Republicans and focusing on that. What worries me most, though, Alex, is that the Republicans, rather than, as they have television time, as they're forced to respond to this, rather than give the examples of the egregious, unnecessary shutdowns and restrictions of the Obama administration, they simply talk in generalities about the fact that we don't have a deal. And, I don't trust any of the House leaders. They are there specifically because they are as controlled as those that operate under the Democratic Party, and they will eventually sell us out there. One of the most important issues is this defunding of Obamacare. As the rollout of Obamacare has occurred, people have found out that this is a nightmare. Not only it's a nightmare in the messed up software of this online system for registration. But they're also taking way too much information and building a database on people, starting to have an automatic curtailment of one. If you don't accept what is presented there, you get on a list and you start getting emails about threats of the payments that you're going to have to make if you don't sign up for Obamacare. People are finding out that the costs are horrendous. It's no longer the Affordable Care Act. It's the Horrendous Care Act now, as people are finding out. So on the domestic side, Alex, things are not good. I expect that the Republicans will eventually cave. They're having trouble doing so this weekend because there are a tremendous amount of Republican congressmen that are hearing horror stories about Obamacare. They want this thing stopped, and so they're unwilling to give in to Boehner, who wants to talk them into a compromise that doesn't include cutting funding to Obamacare.
A couple headlines a few hours ago relating to the food stamp program having some sort of a glitch nationwide, and I believe 17 states have been affected. Now, they say in this report that this is not directly connected to the government shutdown, but from what we've already learned about the Amber Alert aspect of the whitehouse.gov website, with it being dismantled and that causing, outrage, I wonder if there is a connection. I don't know what is going on, but it's very strange timing.
There has to be a connection, Alex. And once again, the word has gone out to inconvenience and make life as difficult as possible, and so you get you have almost 40 million people on food stamps, and you get those 30 million of those people demanding that Republicans do something. And what's interesting is that any time that the public is severely inconvenienced, the Republicans pass an exemption to the government shutdown and say, yeah, we'll pay for that and we'll pay for that, and Obama vetoes it. So it's very, very clear that the Obama administration wants this made. They don't want any relief from this as far as possible until they can get this sufficient coercion down to the Republicans. But let me get to the broad, bigger picture. The bigger picture is that, in fact, a government shutdown is a balanced budget amendment. Everyone in the conservative movement keeps talking about we need a balanced budget amendment. We need to make sure that the government stays within their means. But, in fact, the debt limit ceiling is a balanced budget amendment, and it doesn't require two-thirds to pass it. It only requires a majority. And, when you start shutting down these welfare systems, which are not constitutional, never have been, people really start to complain. The Democrats have for years worked at building this huge constituency of benefit-corrupted recipients of federal aid, including international. And, the government has not cut international foreign aid, even though they've held back a little bit on Egypt because it's so unpopular right now. But they're viewing it as a matter of national security. And we have no business with essentially a bankrupt nation not able to pay its... we'll never pay the amount of indebtedness that we have. It's only a matter of postponing the indebtedness, a default or collapse, until it can be covered by war, as I discussed with you in our 2009 interview. And on that scene, frankly, Alex, things are progressing just as I had predicted. If you remember clear back then, I said the purpose of our intervention around the world is not so much to intervene for oil. It's certainly not for democracy. But the real reason, the long-term strategic reason, is to create hatred for the U.S. as the bully of the world. And if anything has come true, it's been that prediction that the U.S. is more and more hated around the world, especially after the Syrian, when it was very obvious that the U.S. was intent on invading Syria no matter what they did. They had to falsify it, the false flag chemical attack, blame it on the Syrian government. They've done that 3 times already this year, and they tried to make the last one stick. They really have no evidence. It's a matter of sleight of hand. And the U.S. was getting a very nasty reputation as this bully of the world that was trying to stick it to other people no matter what they did. And fortunately, and we see this very few times in history, the globalists who are on this march to take down Syria and Iran had a setback because of a verbal faux pas that John Kerry, Secretary of State, made in London, where in response to a reporter's question, is there anything that Syria can do to avoid this inevitable attack of the West on Syria? And he said, oh, yeah, they can give up their chemical weapons, but they're never going to do that. And, of course, Russia and Syria immediately jumped on that and said, yeah, we'll do that. We'll give them up. And it suddenly set back the globalist agenda tremendously. And to this day, they haven't been able to march forward with an attack on Syria. And that is why Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel is starting to pound the war drums again, giving a speech just this week saying the window of opportunity is ending. Iran is too close to nuclear. We're going to have to strike any day now, no matter what the United States does. And so it looks as if they're hoping that they can strike the Iran and that Syria will not be able to retaliate since it's in the midst of these decommissioning of chemical weapons and have a lot of international inspectors on the ground. As I've said before, the reason why the U.S. was targeting Syria right now instead of Iran is because they were not able to get Iran or to provoke Iran into any kind of response to the many false flag attacks they did on Iran. And they switched terms and decided to try to take out Syria because Syria contains most of the retaliatory capacity against Israel should Israel do a preemptive strike on Iran. Most of the retaliation would come from the 1,000 or so Scud missiles that Syria had, and they were extremely worried about the 10,000 tons of chemical weapons that they are supposed to have in Syria. But all of that's changing right now. What isn't changing is the globalist agenda of continuing to march through the world, antagonizing the world in the false name of democracy, prosecuting a war on terror, which they themselves foment by hiring terrorists, by supporting terrorists as they are in the Syrian opposition right now, and creating various false flag terror attacks as they did on the United States. So nothing has changed on that. All of that is progressing, and what is really progressing, which is most worrisome, is that Russia and China continue to build huge stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction, many, many more missiles coming down the line in China, as well as 4 new aircraft carriers where the keels have been laid. They're working on that blue water navy that I predicted they needed before a Third World War, and Russia is building up its navy again, as well as new generations of the Topol and other missiles that they've been developing. So everything is progressing, according to what I predicted long ago, towards a major Third World War with Russia and China, and the U.S. is indeed handing them the excuse by giving us the image of the bully of the world.
How significant is this Shanghai Free Trade Zone that was enacted on October 1st? And by the way, for listeners, you can Google Shanghai's New World Order, and an article from Forbes magazine comes up. It's an interesting time for this development as the U.S. government goes through a so-called shutdown.
Well, you want to remember, Alex, that there are 3 major predator centers in the world. There's the Anglo-American establishment, of which we are part of it. We call our enemy the globalists here. They are in the West. But China and Russia are also independent hegemons or that intend to create their own new world order. Now, Russia and China are temporarily allied, trying to get ready for a preemptive nuclear strike on the West that will decapitate that so that they can harness the West. They don't want to destroy everything. That's why they'll only hit military targets and try to blackmail us into submission. But China intends to run a new world order, and the Shanghai Free Trade Zone is a part of that. In other words, each one of these predator centers, Russia, China, and our own globalists, intend to run a global world government and where they control all the rest. And that's what all of the current maneuvering is about. And you'll notice even in the Western-oriented free trade zones that they've established, there are thousands of pages of regulation establishing EU-type control structures, whether they're committees or permanent committees to manage and control and establish bureaucracies, as well as establish monetary regulations. This is building the structure for regional New World Order systems that will eventually be knit together. It just happens that China is, especially since the U.S. backed out through the shutdown of its participation in that those meetings here in the Far East, that China's taking the leadership there.
Now, we're going to go to break here in just a moment, but do I have this correct that you see the potential time for a lot of this for example, this war that they want to ferment before they further globalize, around the year 2020 or within a few years of that, based on your projection of when China in particular would be ready for such a conflict with the West?
The only thing that I can predict is when they won't be ready. In other words, what they how far out they still are from being ready to attack the West, and I still think that's at least 8 years out.
Joel Skousen is our guest. When we come back, we'll get into the heart of his current work, which is strategic relocation, the solution to the material that we just discussed. We'll be back after this break. And we are back. We are about to dig our fingers into the new book by Joel Skousen. Actually, it's been out a few years, but it's a survival manual that covers information that you normally don't read about in other survival manuals. And there's a lot of people that are thinking about going off the grid, strategically relocating, removing themselves from dense population centers, as I refer to them. And Joel Skousen does an excellent job in his book helping people determine what is best for them, of course, based on their own geographic regions. So in this segment, I kind of want to highlight, of course, anything Joel wants to begin with in terms of describing his book, but geographic areas within this country where we have the most listeners. For example, the Pacific Northwest, Texas, Colorado, and the general Northeast area. I'm curious what Joel thinks about each of these areas in terms of, what life would be like if we had a major crisis, and what he suggests that they do if they happen to live in those particular areas. So, Joel, what really separates your book from a lot of the other books that are currently available on the market?
Well, there really is no other book on the market that details strategic relocation from a security aspect. None. Mine is the only one out there. Every other book about relocation is about golf courses, retirement centers, climate hospitals, the nice-to-have things, but nothing else covers the strategic threats to people's safety except this one book that I put out ever since. First edition was out in 2000, or just before the year 2000, because there was so much concern about relocation in the Y2K crisis. But what people have available now is the new third edition, which is all color maps covering every state in the union. Not only do I go through all of the general threats, whether it's weather, tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, water purity, chemical pollution, contamination, all of those. I cover the strategic threats of war and even government tyranny and what people can do to protect themselves. But the basic premise of the book is that in any major crisis, and I'm talking major crises, whether they, that affect more than one region of the country, so that remediation of that crisis is not possible in a rapid manner. The biggest threat to you is population density. I mean, it's not the terrorist threat, it's not even war itself, it's the fact that certain crises or threats cut off access to public services, they cut off access to water, power, especially electricity, and perhaps even trucking from long distance for food supplies. And as people might realize, in a large metropolitan area, there's virtually no possibility to do any self-sufficiency whatsoever. There's no water, electricity, and food coming in. People start to pillage within 3 to 5 days. And that's what we haven't faced too often in the United States, because even when we've had a major earthquake in Southern California, for example, you have other regions of the country that can still ship supplies to help remediate that problem into. And it's still a very difficult time. You look at the various storms that have hit the East Coast and how difficult it was for people to have generators. All of that is because of excess competition for resources in a high-density urban population. So anytime you live in a major urban area, your population density is about 1,000 people per square mile. And you can see that's just too many people, even if you live in a rural subdivision, for example. Let's suppose you have room, to have your own garden or other things. The point is when millions of people from the city center start to pillage, and then they start to move outward as they have picked things clean, they eventually get to the rural areas and they get to the farm areas, and it starts to look like what happened in Germany when the Germans started to flee, the Russians coming in, and they took to the roads, and literally everything was picked clean, 2 to 3 miles on either side of any of these major roads that they were walking down, and people were walking away from the towns. Now, I am also experienced enough, having worked in this field for over 40 years, to know that most people cannot relocate. Most of the jobs are in the cities. So in the book Strategic Relocation, I not only talk about safe places relative to having a retreat, because that's the best that most people could do, is use excess funds either for their own family or in combination with a few friends, establish a retreat somewhere that is far enough away from the major cities that they can get there in a crisis, and they can have some stockpiles of food and as well as energy self-sufficiency so that they can do well. And that's one of the major tactics. But in addition, I talk about what people have to do within a city to locate into safe areas around the major metropolitan areas. In other words, rather than some survival experts who try to say, well, there's only 2 or 3 states in the far west, in the mountainous regions, and nobody else is going to survive, so unless you get to this redoubt, you're dead. I don't believe in that. In fact, it doesn't even do any good even if I did believe in it. The point is you've got to help people within the range of what they can do. In other words, even though I rate Florida and New Jersey as states that have a 0 rating because of extreme high population densities or because of geological factors, which when people start to flee, as in Florida, they're all going north, and they're going to cause a problem within Georgia and all of the southern states as people flow out of Florida, because many of these states become untenable just from the lack of electricity. But even in those states, I provide ample examples that if you can't leave or can't relocate, here are the safest areas, which at least can give you medium-term, security in a long-term crisis.
Okay, so where would you recommend are some of the recommended places if someone wants to be free and develop, as you say, colonies of liberty, which is something that I think that we should be doing, to be a part of the solution, to find others of like minds before things get really, really bad? Because it's going to take, I'm just going to say briefly, a lot of work, to truly develop an independent community. And I've learned a lot from my experience living off the grid the last year. And, there's certain challenges people are going to come up against, and they're not always going to be government. They may be the locals that already exist in that area where they want to be off the grid because they don't want outsiders. So I really encourage people, if they are considering strategically relocating, to start practicing, doing trial runs, going out to certain places where people are allowed to build earthships, where the building codes are lax, or where they are extremely affordable. So I was wondering what you thought about what tips you would provide for those that are thinking about living independently, perhaps a community, because it's very difficult to go it alone. And also what you think about some of the rural areas in Colorado.
Well, let's talk about the general strategic value of relocation in various areas of the country. The Northeast is the most populous area in the country. And in most of your urban areas, you have, as I said, over 1,000 people per square mile. Even in the rural areas, you have over 300 people per square mile in many places of the Northeast. And there are so many millions into the high-density population areas, such as the Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia corridor, and it's almost wall-to-wall people even going clear down to Washington, D.C. If those people ever were forced to try to go rural because there's literally nothing to eat within the major cities, then, as I say, you have the 300 people per square mile taking to the roads as well. As they see overwhelming hordes coming down the roads and pillaging, it becomes very, very untenable. Even if you get, an hour or two out of the city, you really got to get much further west in order to get to places where you will have a chance to survive. Now, let's take some of the longer-term threats, like nuclear war. One of the problems with nuclear war is the nuclear doctrine of Russia and China, who are the most likely to cause this war someday, is that they will throw a preemptive high-altitude nuclear EMP strike about 20 minutes before actual nuclear weapons fall on military targets. An EMP strike, which takes about 6 weapons evenly spaced over the United States to take down the entire grid, will do just that, and it will probably be at least 6 weeks before anything starts to come back in electricity. It could take as long as 6 months, because many of these power plants can't even start up without having some contact with the grid somewhere. Only a small percentage of the grid in the United States is capable of self-starting again, which is a problem. But if there is a total lack of electricity, not only are you going to be in the dark, no air conditioning, there will be no news to guide you about what's happening. In fact, that's one of the things that you should realize, or your listeners should realize, that if you have a total blackout, there's no television, no radio, no cell telephones and things, then you'll know an EMP strike has happened, and you've got about 20 minutes before nuclear weapons start to fall. There's probably around a couple of thousand nuclear targets in the United States, and most of those are, military bases, military communications, and satellite communication systems, stockpiles and depots. And I cover where those targets are in strategic relocation. A lot of people would be surprised, even in rural areas, you have targets, sometimes like big radar dishes and domes, related to either the spy system that we're so worried about today or the satellite communication systems. So the Far East is the most difficult to consult with. Everything in the South is a little better, except for the fact that, as I mentioned, you have this problem of Florida someday emptying out, major population centers like Atlanta emptying out, and it's going to be very difficult in those major population centers. And but you can find good, safe rural areas in which it is highly unlikely that you'll get a lot of social unrest. When you get out in Texas, you have a lot of wide open spaces. Of course, you have the lack of water problem as well. The highest rated states in my book are a core of what we call the Intermountain West. These are the high mountain states of Colorado, northern Arizona, parts of Nevada, Utah, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Nevada, and eastern and western Oregon. It's a very large area. It does have a lot of self-sufficiency potential because solar is good in that area. It also has good water resources. Even though the rainfall in most of those areas is less than 15 to 18 inches a year, the mountains stockpile water in terms of snow and other reservoirs and provide it year-round through irrigation. It's gravity-fed. It's not like the Midwest where everything is done by wells that have to pump it out of the ground and put it into these big towers. And when EMP comes, there won't be any power to get water up into those towers. And so within a couple of weeks, those towers will empty out, and they'll be in a very difficult situation as to water. And so Colorado, which you mentioned, has a lot of excellent areas. Unfortunately, the state itself is being downgraded about a half a point because of passing one of the more draconian anti-gun laws. It's not that, as an author of Strategic Relocation, I believe in fighting off the whole world with weapons, but there will be, in major social unrest, there will be malcontents that you may have to contend with, and so I am a believer that citizens should be armed for self-defense. But I am more of the idea that people ought to prepare for concealment, especially when you're dealing with large groups of refugees, which are not evil, they're just starving. And you don't want to be, taking violent action against people that are just starving. But you have to be wise enough to have prepared in advance to conceal your supplies so that you can, still have them available when you need them. And I believe in concealed quarters as well as part of that concealment strategy so that you can get out of harm's way, leave the door open if they have to, and pillagers can come through and take what's they can, but most of your supplies and your person and those of your family is safeguarded within a safe room that has concealed entrance and has strong doors, metal doors and metal jams, so that you can be safe and keep people from finding you and essential supplies.
And that was Joel Skousen from joelskousen.com, and we are discussing his book, Strategic Relocation. When we come back, we will continue to discuss his book and, of course, other solutions that he has for people serious about escaping while there's time from dense population centers. We'll be back after this brief break. We are live with Joel Skousen, a geopolitical and true survival expert, if you look at the book and the information that he provides. And I think that there's certain mistakes people are making with strategically relocating. For example, some Joel expect to have a large water source where they are, to have a well and everything. And how would you kind of describe this, the trade-off philosophy that I'm trying to describe, where sometimes we go without one thing that we think we need in order to really reap the rewards of something else in an area where hardly anybody is?
You've raised several questions in your question. One is the relative value of doing things yourself or seeking out a community of like-minded survivalists or preparedness people. Unfortunately, after 40 years of designing high-security residence and retreats around the nation and consulting with almost every group that has tried to put together survival communities, almost none of those communities work. And that's because preparedness people and survival people are generally pretty independent-minded in many ways. They're not the typical go along with the crowd as unprepared people are who stay in the cities. And so it really becomes difficult for people if you try to put together a formal sharing type organization to have it work. What I have found works better is to develop an informal network in whatever valley you choose. In other words, you're absolutely right that you have to have some relationships with other people because very few people have the financial wherewithal to prepare for any possible contingency. You should provide for the minimum essentials, but you should also have informal relationships. And what I mean by informal relationships is you don't have to have joint property, you don't have to have joint equipment that you share, but you need to have a knowledge of who you can depend upon in an area. As I say, people need, let me just give you an example. I've just fielded a question from a group of investors that wanted to do a survival community. And they were going to front the money, to have all of these facilities and things available, and they were going to have various security aspects involved. And in fact, there's another community which isn't very well thought out called the Citadel in Idaho. And unfortunately, once you start to market something when you're going to sell to people and the news media gets a hold of it, they start to denigrate you as a survivalist community, as a compound, and start to talk about this bunch of extremists that are coming to our state, and they start to oppose you. And so anybody who's at all mild-mannered or not extreme says, I don't want to be associated with that. And you see what I'm saying? The problem of getting together and forming a community whereby you have to market or sell lots to people to attract buyers to come in, you risk getting yourself labeled by the mainstream community as extremist. And that is
it's funny you mentioned Idaho, because there's a documentary that was made before 2000 about survivalist communities, and Bo Greitz was in it, and a few others that were living in this Idaho community, and I think there's Jack McLam with his. So now they've gotten all of this exposure. Ultimately, the more people you have, the more problems. If you have, say, a large community and there's a domestic dispute and the police are called, I notice this behavior with certain people out there in the valley, that we're living the off-the-grid dream, but every now and then, certain dramas would come up because people are still going to be people. And the police would be called out from Costilla County for some stupid domestic dispute or complaint from another neighbor.
Well, given that situation, what I'm just saying is it almost never works to try to establish a formal, where you live tangent to one another, next door neighbors, everybody's a survivor. It's just almost impossible to do that without getting this bad reputation and without having the infighting. Even as people as cohesive as religious organizations haven't made it. I've consulted on several groups that have a religious orientation. There always ends up being infighting. There are egos involved in religious organizations as well. So what I have found in my long experience in this field that really works is that in every area which is considered, and the best areas for survival are rural areas that are still within probably an hour's commute of a reasonable metropolitan area, so that you can get to building supplies, so that it doesn't cost you an arm and a leg to have contractors come out and do things that you can't do. And believe me, if you get out so far, you get out 3 or 4 hours away from any major commercial center, and you literally have to do it yourself or pay an arm and a leg to have people come out. But I have found in the best survival areas and preparedness areas, with my book out here and other people's recommendations and people like Lou Rawls or Jim Rawls, you have people getting informed about where are the best areas that are far enough away from these dangerous metro areas like Southern California or Denver. And you don't have to be 20 hours away. Even 2 to 3 hours away is just fine. And what happens is that you will find there are numerous people who got there just like you got there without any coordination, without belonging to any group, and, you can find each other. Whether you get on chat rooms, and you've got to be very careful. You don't want to be laying out all of your cards and bragging about what you have, but whether through going to church or whether or not going to town and just getting a conversation with somebody else at the feed store or the hardware store who's buying the same kind of stuff you have, then you find people and you start to knit together with informal networks. You know who you can call upon, but actually there's greater strength in not being right next door or in a compound because you can't be targeted. And then if one person's house becomes untenable, he's got somebody else that's not in the same area that he can go to. And there is, when you look at the history of people who had to hide from tyrannical government or hide from rotting people, it's important not to have all of your eggs in one basket.
Absolutely. And I kind of want to close with this. I'm not a religious person, but I did a fair amount of praying before I found that spot that I found. But I love this state. And I do feel like there was a force greater than myself that helped me build those networks and friendships. And I think that when we have this outlook on life, when it comes to disasters, and we truly try to walk in the light and do good, good does come back tenfold, whether we do good or whether we do evil. I've seen it in my own life, the mistakes I've made, and I've seen it in the lives of others.
Well, I believe in God and I believe in Satan. I believe that there are real evil forces in the universe and good forces in the universe, and that we aren't totally lost, even though this secret combination of power does seem to be so all-powerful we may not ever win back our liberty as a nation, but we certainly will have pockets of liberty that will survive. I'm a believer that God does inspire people to come to the right areas, and even without joining a formal group, inspiration can bring people together. And whether you call it karma or inspiration or, being guided by God, it does happen. And there are evil forces out there, but I think living a good life, as you said, does pay dividends, because I can tell you that good people can sense bad people are untrustworthy, and just like evil people can sense good people. And so we do have a conscience. We do have these inner abilities to be able to perceive and even to get warnings. I tell people all the time, one of the biggest problems I have is people call me up and say, just tell me where the safe place is and, I'll go there. And I say, well, it's not that simple. Every place that's safe for me isn't necessarily safe for you. The biggest problem with Y2K is that people dropped their job, went out and spent all their savings on self-sufficiency equipment and found out that self-sufficiency was very expensive. They ran out of money. They were calling me back up and saying, well, what do I do now? And I said, well, you just can't outrun your financial lifeline. There's nobody who's going to be totally self-sufficient. It takes millions, in fact, to get enough equipment and enough backup equipment that you really don't need anything in society anymore. And nothing, is
and then I'm sorry, Joel, that is the end of this segment. Thank you so much for coming on the air with us tonight, and hopefully we can talk to you next year in 2014.
All right, look forward to it, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joel. It's been an honor. We'll be back right after this brief break.